The views and opinions expressed on the One Mark podcast are those of the authors or guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of One Mark. Any content provided by our guests or authors are of their own opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything.
Our second step is exchanging reasons for positions, right? So the first step is quite brief, even though I explain it quite a lot. It's brief, it's just the identifying part. The second part, this is where we sort of are looking at the why behind you prioritizing what you want to prioritize and you prioritizing what you want to prioritize. And once again, like we said, communication is a part of it a lot, and listening as well.
Dumelang, Absheni, Sanbonani, Khoyadag, Molweni, Lochani. Welcome to the One Mark podcast, where we delve into real conversations about civil rights education. I am one of your hosts, Innocent Mohammed, Karibeya Motswana mo Afrika Bora, and I am thrilled to have you join us as we embark on this beautiful educational journey. As usual, I am not alone. I am with my co-host.
Hello everyone and welcome. Senamyela to yet another episode of the One Mark podcast. My name is Mbali Mota Ntombi Mswati Lamvulani Ndlebenkomo, all the way from Mpumalanga. Thank you for joining us in today's episode. We want this podcast to be a safe space for everyone to engage openly about civic education and service delivery. We hope to start conversations in your homes, in your cars, or wherever you are.
Yes, Mbali, today we have a thought-provoking episode.
Yeah?
We are going to be talking about conflict resolution. I mean, South Africa is a beautiful country rich in diverse cultures, history, and communities.
Yeah.
But I mean, like in any other diverse society, conflicts and tensions may arise. So today we're going to talk about the intricacies, surrounding conflict, and we're going to talk about how to prevent conflict, and if we find ourselves there having conflict, how do we solve it?
Absolutely. I think it's very important to ensure that whenever conflict arises, it's visible to communities and moderators, because when you have to deal with conflict and it's coming from the surface, it's really, really difficult, and it can erupt and become something really, really, really big. I mean, there's so many conflicts that we've seen or experienced in South Africa, so I really can't wait, and I'm looking forward to today's episode.
Yeah.
With the help of today's guest, Hope Mathole, practicing psychologist, would like to unpack conflict resolution. We want to know how to unpack conflict in our homes, in our offices, and in our communities as a whole. Thank you so much, Hope, for joining us in today's episode. Please kindly introduce yourself to our viewers at all.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. My name is Hope Mathole. I am a counseling psychologist. I have been in the field for the last 2 years as an independent practitioner. I got my license basically in 2021. So I currently run a private practice that focuses on career counseling. We're looking at like subject choices, non-subject choices. It's a virtual practice as well. So I'm looking at study methods and just, grade 12s going into university, career evaluations. And then I do have a 9-to-5, as we all always do. And side gigs as well. I work at a physical rehabilitation hospital. I am the primary psychologist in the stroke unit, the CVA, stroke unit, CVA unit.
Awesome. Talk about girl power.
Yes.
Hope, thank you so much for joining us today. And I have to say, your name is amazing, especially for this. It is so fitting that you're going to give us hope on how to deal with conflict.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to learn on how to deal with it myself, but particularly within communities. We've seen, recently in the country, there's been so much conflict, whether people are protesting because they're unhappy and have a conflict with their leaders, or really, xenophobia and, so many other areas. So let's start from the beginning. Because I mean, conflict really, it can really affect peace in communities. So, what exactly is conflict, and what causes conflict in general?
So conflict is basically when two or more parties are not getting along
Yeah.
because they either one have different outcomes, two different goals, or just different intentions, right?
Yeah.
And I think to dispel the myth of the fact that conflict is something that's negative, and that's what I think a lot of us think.
Yes, definitely.
Conflict is actually a positive thing.
Is it?
Because there's so many benefits to conflict, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
So yes, it's basically when we have the three things that I mentioned that are different. So it's not just between two parties as well, but it's between two or more parties. And funny enough, we can also have conflict within ourselves, but that's a story for another day. We can also have internal conflict. The causes of conflict, there are many different causes, but I always say, and you guys will probably notice throughout this conversation, I'm going to say the words communication and the words perspective a lot, right? So the causes of conflict, one, let's start with perspective. So there's an example that I usually make. I usually use a phone, but because both of you are here, we're going to use that. So both of you are on different sides. Both of you can see me.
Yes.
But both of you can see different sides of me.
Yeah.
Right? So you can see my many piercings. She doesn't see that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
if we constantly go on, both of you, about, but there are 5 holes. No, there's 1 hole.
Oh.
No, but there are 5. No,
Okay.
there's 1. Right? So that's a different perspective. Because all of us in life are always standing at different perspectives.
Yeah.
Due to the realities that we have, due to the traumas that we have, due to just life experience, because we all look at life through the lens of our life experience. So perspective can be a difference, and then as well communication styles.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have noticed, sometimes we're all saying the same thing. Have you been in like an argument?
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
When you're outside, it's usually when you are aware that these two people are fighting or they're in conflict, but both of them are saying the exact same
The
thing.
same thing.
They're just saying it in different words.
Yeah.
You know, so another thing is that communication style, that I could be saying the exact same thing that you are saying,
Yeah.
but you are saying it in different words and I'm saying it in different words.
Yeah.
Right? So communication style as well is another thing. And then the last one is lack of conflict resolution skills. So if we don't know how to resolve conflict,
Yeah.
we'll constantly find ourselves in conflict in negative ways as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Hope, you're a psychologist. You're a practicing psychologist. You work and deal with different people.
Yeah.
Is there a particular pattern that you have seen people adopting in dealing with conflict, or is it different for everyone? Can you please just elaborate?
I think both are true. So it is very different for everyone. But the main thing I think is like awkwardness and discomfort. And I always try to explain like the concept of the first family. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. So the first family concept is the fact that every one of us were born into a family somehow, whether it was a foster family, whether it was an orphanage, a home, but that is some form of a family.
Yeah.
And based on our first families are things that we learn, and basically, so how to make relationships, how to interact, but also conflict management, right? So if in your family, conflict, a way of resolving conflict was to fight physically, then that's what you know.
Yeah.
Until you leave and you meet other people who resolve conflict differently. But until you have a need to actually change that. Because I can see, maybe let's say when I move out from tertiary, I can see that people are dealing with conflict different. But unless I feel like there's a need for me to apply that method, I won't do it. Right? Discomfort, many different things really, but mostly discomfort and awkwardness. So once again, on the other side of the spectrum, I listen to a lot of Sarah Jakes Roberts. This is T.D. Jakes' daughter. And she usually says that she never saw her family fight, her mom and dad as a couple fight, which became a point of contention in her marriage. Why? Because she's never seen it. She didn't know what a healthy fight was. And maybe they did it to protect the kids or for whatever reason. But then for someone like that, when they are faced with conflict, they don't know what to do because they've never seen it.
Yeah.
Do you get what I mean? So, that's why I say, I wouldn't say patterns per se, but from our first families, there's certain things that we've learned and internalized. So based on that, it sort of creates our perception of what conflict is. So if you were beaten up, you'll be uncomfortable and you'll be scared when conflict arises because you're scared that someone will start beating you up because of the conflict. Right? So it's things like that. People do change their way of managing conflict. But like I said, there needs to be a need. We don't just, I like to use the pap example. If in my family, when we cook pap, we put water in, then we put maize meal, then we put salt. In your family, if you guys put maize meal first, then salt, then water, and I see you doing that, I mean, I could see it and I could employ it, but I could see it and just leave it. Unless there's a need for me, I feel like, okay, it's very ineffective how I'm managing conflict or how I've learned from my family.
Yeah. I love that. Let me take you back to when you spoke about the causes of conflict and you spoke about perspective. Let's take it and apply it to a community. So now if we are in a community and we sit down and say we want to improve our community, but we have different interests, like you said. Different people, we deal with things differently in terms of communication, in terms of conflict resolution. So how do we navigate people with different interests? Like you said, I mean, our interests and fears and all of that are shaped by our lives, right? Our backgrounds, the first family, like you said. Then how do we navigate? I mean, if I, for example, want to prioritize road safety in the community because I was in an accident and I think that it's important, I don't want it to happen to somebody else. And there is Mbali wanting to prioritize building a soccer stadium to get the kids off the streets. How do we navigate between those two and become sensitive to one another? Firstly, I want to know, how do we prevent conflict? And if we find ourselves in a stage of conflict, then what do we do?
Yeah.
So with regards to prevention of conflict, we can't unfortunately avoid or prevent conflict.
Yeah.
Remember I said in the beginning, conflict is not a negative thing.
Yeah.
It can be negative based on how we resolve it.
Yeah.
So I want to dispel the myth of conflict is wrong, we have to avoid it. It's like stress. You cannot avoid stress. There are stresses in everyday life and you got to be stressed.
Yeah.
But we want to more focus on the resolution. We want to focus on developing healthy resolution strategies.
Yeah.
Developing healthy skills for managing conflict.
Yeah.
So it's not, we can't avoid conflict.
Yeah.
That's impossible. So even if we do it in a very healthy way, we'll still have conflict. We won't fight physically and cuss each other out and swear, but we'll still have conflict, right? And then I'm going to go through 5 steps that I brought with me here of how we can resolve conflict to directly respond to what you were saying.
Right.
In terms of, you know, the two of you now have different intentions, say as community leaders or even as people in the community.
Yeah.
So the first step is basically we want to define the conflict. We want to define what the conflict is or what the problem is.
Yeah.
And because there are two entities involved, we don't want to define it from one standpoint. So we're not just going to define it for you alone and then we leave Mbali out. We need to define it for both of you guys, right? So we want to identify for each party what is your need, what is the problem, because there can be a problem, and I'll use the load shedding example. All of us are impacted by load shedding, but very different, right? So we can't just leave it as load shedding impacts us. It impacts us on different levels, even though it impacts all of us in South Africa, right? So in that first stage, we want to define the problem for each individual. So from everyone's perspective, from everyone's point of view, we want that to be clear for every party involved. And that obviously, as you can imagine, like I said, communication is going to be coming up a lot. It requires communication. So you have to sit and tell her, this is how... this is why I feel this is a problem, and this is why I want to prioritize road safety first, or whatever it is. And you can say, this is why I want to first, I think it's more important for us to first sort out youth unemployment, right? And you say why. So there's a lot of listening that's involved, and there's a lot of communication that's involved. We have to use our words to communicate, because the opposite of communication is assumption. If you sit there, you can just think like, she's just not listening to me. But that's an assumption. You have to communicate to actually determine that. So that's our first step. Our second step is exchanging reasons for positions, right? So the first step is quite brief, even though I explained it quite a lot. It's brief. It's just the identifying part. The second part, this is where we sort of are looking at the why behind you prioritizing what you want to prioritize and you prioritizing what you want to prioritize. And once again, like we said, communication is a part of it a lot, and listening as well, and understanding each other. And what that does is this perspective that we spoke about, right? Let's go back to that example again. When you give sort of your whys, she's able to understand that, it means that Hope on this side has 1 million earrings and holes. And then you get the same, Hope on this side has just one. Right? So it gives us empathy. In psychology, we explain empathy as walking there's a quote that says walking a mile in someone's shoes, but in psychology generally we explain it as walking in someone's shoes. So it gives perspective, it gives understanding, right? So now we have understanding. It's not just, I just want to do my thing selfishly. I understand that yours is important as well, and that mine is not the only important one. Okay. And then we move to the third one. The third one is understanding the other person's perspective. So this is like a deeper sense of creating empathy. And this also is where we can get deep into the stories. And remember we spoke about life experience and how we see things through the perspective of life experience. You can say road safety is important, God forbid, but because a cousin of mine was killed on the road or was knocked off by a car. And then you can say youth employment is important. My little brother, God forbid, has been unemployed for years, and this is affecting our family and this way. So we're deepening that empathy and that understanding and that exchanging of perspectives as well. All right. And then the fourth one is options for mutual gain. And what we want to do here is we basically want to come up with every potential resolution or resolutions. It can be more than one. So we sort of brainstorm. The two of you would basically brainstorm that. It creates engagement as well. And once again, a deeper level of understanding. It gets you guys to connect to a certain level. And just to disclaim as well, you're not now completely not going to care about your thing just because you're so understanding. That's not how it works, and vice versa as well. You'll have a bit of understanding, right? You'll give a bit of grace as well in that sense. And then that's also where we'll identify what are the obstacles. Let's say we have 5 different resolution strategies for the 2 challenges. What are the obstacles? It's almost like a SWOT analysis. So we have, let's say we have 5. Let's do a SWOT analysis on that 5. And then, you leave room for mutual agreement as well. And then there's openness for negotiation. I always say to my patients, every healthy relationship, there's always room for negotiation, because then there's not an abuse of power. Anybody can come in, there's compromising, but mainly there's room for negotiation. And then that process happens as well. And then the last one is basically researching a wise agreement. So let's say we've come up with 5. Are all 5 going to work? Can all 5 be implemented? Or do we just need one? Right? So that's basically, and the ones that we take need to be fair for all, as much as possible. So it won't always be that they'll be fair 100% for both of you. And it's not, and that's the thing in relationships, right? Whether we're in relationships personally, mom and dad, parents, children, the subsystem of children, and even in the work environment. Sometimes fair for all or meeting each other somewhere, it's not always 50-50. Sometimes it's 20-80. Sometimes it's 60-40. So, and they'll always move. There needs to be flexibility in that sense. So that's like a model that I usually use in practice for conflict resolution strategies.
I'm reminded as you speak, if you remember, during the ITP process, how leaders or elected leaders will go into communities just to know the priorities that they have, because they want to understand both sides. They want to see this side and the other side, and then they bring them together. And after they brought all of them together, they see which priorities now do we take up. That's when our community leaders will come in and take up that. It's so interesting, and it's so not far-fetched from local government. I want to move into xenophobia. Xenophobia is one of the conflicts that can come into my mind right now. It happened, and it keeps on happening in South Africa. We can't really say we've reached a point where we really eradicated xenophobic attacks. Are there any strategies, if any, that you think we can use or employ to deal with xenophobia?
I think once again, just to give an overview, when we think about xenophobia, it's basically, in this context, it's basically us as South Africans basically attacking people. I don't like the word foreign, but I can't think of another word. But people from different countries, right? So once again, it highlights that perspective that we spoke about. I've heard people say, they came in and they took our jobs. And they're speaking, for example, about a person who's in the IT field. But you don't have an IT degree. Like, how did they take your job, right? So once again, it's a perspective thing. So when we talk about all the different steps of conflict resolution that I spoke about, we need to employ that as a general. I think I've explained that quite extensively, and I won't do that as well. And I won't do that anymore. But it's a perspective thing. And once again, ladies, just to make you aware, we can't force people. Like, we're speaking about all these nice conflict resolution steps, these nice 5 steps, but at the end of the day, people still get to choose what they're going to do and how they're going to resolve something. So if you think about something in that example, someone who says that, yeah, this person stole my job, it's very unlikely. I mean, in other instances probably, but it's very unlikely that this person will be like, I'm going to put myself in this individual's shoes now and understand that they come from a country where there was war, where they probably had to come in this side illegally because it was unsafe there, right? So perspective says we put ourselves in the next person's shoes. Like, what was going on for them to come, to South Africa? What was happening that side? But once again, it's a hard thing to do as well. Because are you going to go to someone who lives in a shack and who truly believes that this person took their job or their job opportunity, even though, and for many reasons with them as well, there are many reasons why they are there. There's a lot of whatever it is that happened for them not to be where they desire to be. And we're not blaming them. We're not saying they're lazy. It's not as easy as people are lazy. But think about, I don't know, 40-year-old Ntabi saying, who is sitting in a shack somewhere and really feels like these people just came in and they took over and they started shops and they
shops everywhere.
And everything. Like, how are you gonna? You can. I'm not saying it's impossible too, but how are you gonna convince that individual to be like, babes, let's have empathy. This is the reason why they left. And when they came here, they actually used opportunities. And we're not saying Tabi Singh is not doing the same.
Yeah.
So it's very tricky. It's not as black and white as we'd want it to be. And you can have an Tabi Singh who will understand and who also, not sort of like sit in their sorrow and whatever it is that is happening and stand up and do something. But once again, there's an Tabi Singh who's done so many things, but things are just not working out. And that's why it's very easy to feel like, they just came in and took our jobs. Yeah. But it's not as straightforward.
You know what? That's fantastic. And I find that really, really fascinating. But we do know that, South Africa has a troubled history, right? Mm-hmm. We had to transition from apartheid to democracy. So between leaders and community members, there is sort of like a lack of trust. Also because, we have been lacking services and all of those issues, So when there are issues like that within a community, like you're saying, 40 and Tabi saying is sitting in a shack there, as community leader, what can be their role? Other than, I get the model that you told us, the 5-step model, but what role do communities leaders play in this instance, to try and bring conflict resolution? Because, they're not trained psychologists like you, but what can be done? I'm just talking about a leader there somewhere in the northwest, there in a rural area, and they are faced with these issues. Yeah. What can they do other than applying the model that you spoke about?
So community leaders, rather, obviously are tasked with a lot and they have a lot of responsibilities. I think one of the things is to really be intentional about the end user. The reason why you are a community leader is not for yourself. It's to service people. You know, you have to, you're a spokesman, you are a spokesperson of a whole community. You are an advocate for the rights of a community. So that's a very big responsibility. So they need to sort of always consider and think about the end users. And one of the ways that they can do that is, first of all, to educate themselves. Community leaders are quite, and I think the reason why they are community leaders is because they are quite knowledgeable on a lot of things, but not knowledgeable on everything, right? So they need to immerse themselves. So the education on two levels. On one side, it's sort of, and you alluded to this earlier, but basically being a part of the community somehow, in order to, like when it's campaign time, everybody's kissing babies and all that. That's not being part of the community. Part of community is sitting down and having conversation with people to get their life experience, to get what their needs are, and to get why these people have these needs, right? So it also touches on some of those steps that we spoke about it for conflict management. So it's like education on that side, immersing themselves in the community. I have not been alive for very long, just 29 years, but but I think I could be wrong. I stand to be corrected. I think back in the day, community leaders lived in the same communities and were more involved in the community.
Yes, they were able to experience what people, be on the ground, really, and experience what people are dealing with on a daily.
So it was relational, right? But now it's almost like there's a hierarchy. The community leader lives, or the chief or whatever lives like there. Their house is pretty. It's got, back to load shedding once again. It's got inverters, it's got generators and all of that. And maybe there's a reason for that, security and whatever. I mean, life has become quite tricky. I get that. But to get life experience, that's the one part, to immerse themselves with the community, for there to be no hierarchy. It is originally there, unfortunately, because there is a power difference there. But that's the one part. But for community leaders as well, to educate themselves in the specific context with regards to conflict and conflict resolution. Part of our scopes as psychologists is to advise on policies, like policies across the board, whether it's government, school, behavior, whatever it is. Because as you can imagine, we've been trained in the science of behavior.
Right.
As long as there's a person, there's behavior. Even whether it's one person or more people, right? So that's part of our scope. So the education part of it can have psychologists to educate yourself on how you lead, and specifically with this conversation of conflict management, but also to bring in those resources for the community as well, right? So that's what I mean by on two different levels. Educating yourself from the experiences of the community, but from a resource center as well, and a resource perspective as well. And then the other thing is to basically, so imagine if you have a community leader who's educated, and let's stick to the conversation on conflict, right? How much more effective will management of conflict be in the community? If one neighbor comes and says, this neighbor did this and this and this and this, right? It will be handled in a way that it's a bit more gentle, a bit more soft, as opposed to in a harsh way, right? And that's why it's important to sort of have education on both those sides.
Okay.
I'm just sitting here wondering, I understand, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Having an investor, moving to a different neighborhood, and staying there, and being a counselor I would make an example of Alex. How do I bring myself to these people at their level to really understand and immerse myself into their shoes, to understand, so that when there's conflict, or when conflict arises, or when service delivery issues, how do you make priorities and say this is important? Because to you, electricity, you stay in Sandton, you don't really face that problem, but the people who stay in Alex face that on a daily. How do you bring yourself back to that as a community leader?
And for some people, it's not even bringing yourself back. They've never had that experience, that community leader. So we'll have community leaders who grew up in Alex, in Cosmo, and got out and got to Sandton. But we'll have community leaders who've never had that experience, right? So it's on two levels. It's how do I bring myself back if I've had that experience of maybe poverty or socioeconomic status that's a bit lower than where I am now. But for another leader, they've never completely been there. And that also goes back to when I was saying we can, as much as possible, learn empathy and share experiences, but we'll never fully understand another person's story and what someone is going through, right? And that goes back to the trust aspect. One of your question before, I actually didn't cover that part. It's talking about trust. So trust is when we can only trust when we feel safe.
Yeah.
So if we have this leader who's out there, who never says hi, who's surrounded by security guards, I'll never trust you with my story, first of all.
Yeah.
I will never trust that I can be vulnerable and that my vulnerability and transparency will be handled with care, and you'll hold me in the space, right? So think about just with you guys, there are friends that you know that I can tell her everything or him everything. I can cry, I can say anything, and it will be handled safely and with dignity. But the other friends, they are friends. It's not that they are not friends, but they're not close as that best friend or that closest friend. And the difference between that is how they handle you, right? How they handle you at your lowest, right? Community members will never ever trust a leader who is untouchable, right? So it's on the side of the community members, but directly to answer your question, it's basically interacting with people, whether you sit in a conversation, or whether you just sit and observe. You just visit a community and observe how we data collect. Is not just from just conversations, but how we interact. And I don't think that there's nothing completely that will not penetrate. So like you're saying, they've never or they need to remind themselves of how it's like there. There's no way that if you are human who is there on that position because you want that community, after spending a couple of hours, maybe twice a week or however long, by the time you leave, like there's absolutely nothing that has penetrated, then we need to ask the question, why are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really, we've covered a lot with regards to communication. I want to take us back a little bit. You spoke about listening.
Yes.
And I wanted to just tap into that a little bit because I think that most of us do not listen. I think Bali and I have been doing a good job listening today.
I think so.
We did quite well. We've
High
been
five.
listening. High five.
Well done,
We
guys.
have been listening. But I mean, it is quite difficult, and in some instances, in our different parts of the world. I mean, for example, if I'm talking, like you said, if I'm talking to a friend, I'm talking to Bali, who I can tell her I had a bad day. This was my experience, and she will listen and she will have empathy. And then I go and talk to another friend that's gone who does not listen at all. I won't feel safe. What are the listening skills that we should learn? I mean, for us individually and also within communities.
I think, and we probably all aware of this, we usually listen to answer.
Yes.
Or we listen to give our
Like
perspective.
Gone, the friend Gone.
Oh, is it?
I'm
Is that what
talking
she
about.
does?
Yes.
So sometimes a lot of the times we listen to, because we want to answer, because we want to put our point across. That's why in a conflict, you'll find two people speaking over each other. But like how? Because nobody's listening. Healthy communication is when there's, there's, I can't remember the actual concept that we call it in psychology, but it's almost like the giver, and when there's a feedback loop from the receiver. That's how we're able to have an effective conversation. And I think people don't just not listen because they don't want to. Life is busy, guys.
Yeah.
One, life is busy. Two, we all going through something somehow. Do you get what I mean? It's almost like, okay, I want to be here, I want to listen, but I want to run off quickly. Right? There's a concept that's called, and it fits so perfectly here. It's called milkshake multitasking by Dr. Caroline Leaf. She's also like a psychologist, actually born here but now in America. And what she says is we cannot multitask. Like our brain doesn't have the capacity to multitask. So because life is busy, we're sometimes forced to multitask. But what we don't realize is quantity time, we don't have time in terms of measurable time, but then we lose the quality of even that conversation because we're choosing time, which is understandable, like I said, like we're not blaming anyone here, but we end up choosing time. Like I have to do 5 things, I'll do all of them today, or I'll do 2 at the same time. So I'll type while I'm speaking to my child, right? But something's gonna suffer. So we need to, in a general conversation, there needs to be, we need to give each other turns, but also there needs to be active listening. Active listening is I'm listening to what you say. Yes, I do have an opinion, but I'm not listening to answer. I'm listening to understand. So that's like the main tip that I can give.
Fantastic. And with regards to, are there any initiatives where maybe there is like where you go to schools or whatever to teach children about conflict resolutions? Are there within communities, especially communities like Mbali was saying, that experience xenophobia and whatnot? Do you guys in your field go to those communities and actually try and mediate, and where can people also just get help? If you find yourself in a situation in a community, your leader's not hearing you, he doesn't have listening skill, he or she doesn't have listening skills, or your neighbor is not listening to you, is there a place where people can go and reach people like you to say, help me with this? And are you in the capacity to help?
So the psychologist's scope is very broad. I know people believe that you go to a psychologist because you're crazy. There's so many things that people our scopes in all different categories of psychology, our scopes are literally like a full page long, like a full A4 page, and there's like just bullet points. And I did mention one of them is, advising on policy, because I mean, human behavior is everywhere. Human behavior is in the corporate, it's in the creative field, it's in politics, where there are people, there's human behavior.
Yes.
A lot of psychologists do projects. I know a lot of people who do different projects. I don't have, I have one specific project in mind that I'll say at the end. But yeah, in the form of research, but also in the form of just, this is a community project. Because part of being a psychologist, as you can imagine, it's not necessarily a prerequisite, but we get into this field not because of the money. There's no amount of money that can reimburse what we do as psychologists. But a huge part of what we do is psychoeducational workshops. So some of it's different topics, but one of the topics can be conflict management, right? I don't know if you guys are, I'm actually thinking of another initiative now. It's the Pillow Pepper Train. I don't know if any of you know about it.
Yes.
The Pillow Pepper Train. I've been on the train twice. It's an amazing initiative by, I think it's sponsored by Transnet.
Yeah.
It's 2 trains. They basically go around South Africa.
Yeah.
And the train will park 1 week, let's say, at Kimberley Station, 1 week somewhere else. And what we, on both times when I went on the train, what we did is we would go into communities, we'd go into like different types of communities and spaces just to do education on that. So one of our topics would be conflict management. And then as a psychologist, it's once again, it's also not like a firm prerequisite, but you encourage to identify a community that you just work with as a way of just giving back. So everywhere where there's a psychologist, there's somehow a community project happening. Right? Whether it's specifically relating to conflict management or just many different topics and in an ongoing capacity. So in the form of research, there are NPOs. I have an NPO, it's called Contagious Classy Divas Network. It's specifically for women, based in the Vaal. That's my passion project too. So, because I'm from the Vaal. So that's my sort of like passion project. Like I said, we're advised to do that as psychologists. And it's not just conflict resolution based, but obviously there's parts of that we touch on, all right? And then there's one that I found this morning, which was actually very interesting. It's based in Cape Town. It basically operates to contribute in building a society that embraces nonviolence, peaceful methods of conflict resolution, and using conflict transformation. So they basically work with communities and they work with leaders as well. I want to remember the name because I didn't put the name here. I think it's ACCRA. ACCRA. Their website is literally www.accra.org. I saw it this morning. Very interesting. I don't know if they're just based in Cape Town or if they go like in spaces as well. Another thing that psychologists do as well, or are found, is sort of like I know we're speaking specifically about communities, but we have different types of communities apart from just we live together, we're a community, but work communities as well. So think about in the workspace, we're also different. We all come from different backgrounds. A lot of conflict's going to happen there, right? Like the example that you were making, maybe there are 2 projects, but the owner or the head leader or the leader rather of the one project thinks, let's do this one first because it's important. And the other one is like, no, let's do this one first because it's important. So we have a lot of psychologists who are in, and the term for it is employee wellness / emotional well-being, whether it's workshops or talks. And that's another leg that I provide in my private practice. I don't know if you remember in the beginning I said that I'm doing career counseling stuff, but another part of it is sort of your talks, your workshops and your trainings. So part of what I offer specifically, I know a lot of psychologists as well, is conflict resolution in the workspace, in a family space, it's not necessarily therapy, but it's more psychoeducational work.
South Africa is really diverse, and sometimes it's really difficult to run away from conflict. What advice or message would you give to people and say, whenever you're faced with conflict, this is my go-to, do this?
I think, even in light of apartheid, our past in South Africa, I feel like every single race and culture has something to contribute. And once again, if we would sit and have conversation, we'd find out that, this is how the Basotho people resolved conflict.
Right.
Was it an effective way? Is it healthy? Because what we know from apartheid is that that was horrible way. That was a horrible way of resolving conflict, right? Why? Because remember from my last step, the 5 resolutions, we said we want a fair, not a win per se, but a fair outcome for everyone. That was not a fair outcome for Black people, right? And in how conflict management or conflict was resolved. So think about all the different cultures. If we'd all sit down, whether it's in our group of friends, at work, maybe 5 minutes in a day or like an hour every week, just to be like, how do you guys resolve conflict at home? How do you guys resolve conflict in your culture, in your religion, in your race? And then we go to that, I think it's the fourth step of the conflict resolution, to say, let's look at all of them, which one is the best that we can choose from. So once again, lived experience. If we actually took time to sit and communicate, there's so much that we can learn from each other and integrate that would basically benefit all of us as blacks, white, every different race, every different religion, culture, and tradition, and even gender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is fantastic, and that wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much, Hope, for coming today. I think you are leaving us with a lot of hope that South Africa will learn how to resolve conflict, and I hope you at home as well and listening to us learned so much, and you know from now that communication is very, very important, and we should be empathetic to one another and listen to one another.
Hope, as my last question, I'd just like to ask you, as South Africa is preparing to vote, what message would you like to share with South Africans?
Yeah, there's a lot happening in South Africa right now, but I think we need to research, guys. Once again, let's not vote with our emotions, because we're going to keep a certain party, because, I don't know, we're scared apartheid will come back. And I understand that's a valid fear that a lot of people have, especially a lot of black people. But let's do our research. I'm gearing to go research, like what's happening in the different parties. But I think we need to also understand that there's no perfect party. We're working with human beings. I think because there's been so much that has happened in our country, we almost want someone to come in or a party to come in and fix every single thing at the same time. That's not going to happen. And that's how we deny ourselves of seeing even when a party is actually doing well, because there's been, and understandably so, there's been so much that's been happening. We just want everything to end, but it's not going to end in 2 years. It's not going to end after the person is elected or the party is elected. So let's research. Let's not make decisions emotionally. Let's find out what's happening, what party is advocating for what, and let's decide from that perspective.
There you have it, guys. Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. Please make sure that you do research before you vote for whoever it is that you're going to vote for in next year's elections. Make sure that you do your research and vote for an informed perspective. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to follow us on our socials. Please follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and our Instagram page. Until then, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, and that wraps up today's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay engaged. And together, let's unlock the power of knowing our rights. Goodbye.
Goodbye.